John had spent the last 6 months on deployment overseas. Every day in the field, he dreamed about the moment he would finally return home to his wife, Emily, and to the life he had worked so hard to build. John wasn't just a soldier. He was a decorated officer, respected by his men, admired by his superiors. But what mattered most to him was Emily. She had been his anchor, his safe harbor through the storms of life. When his best friend Mark offered to check in on her while John was gone, he had been grateful. Mark had been in John's life since childhood. They grew up together, went fishing, played ball, even enlisted in the military at the same time, though Mark left the service years ago. To John, Mark was more than a friend. He was family. When the day finally arrived, John stepped off the transport plane, scanning the crowd until he saw Emily's familiar face. She smiled, though there was something strange in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. Mark stood beside her, clapping him on the shoulder with forced enthusiasm. John brushed it off, too happy to be home to think much of it. At first, everything seemed normal. Emily cooked his favorite meals, asked about his deployment, and smiled whenever John told his stories. But as the days passed, John began noticing subtle changes. Emily would step away to answer phone calls in hushed tones. She suddenly guarded her phone, keeping it face down at the dinner table. At night, she would go to bed early, claiming exhaustion, while John sat in the living room replaying every little detail of her behavior in his mind. Mark, too, seemed different. He stopped dropping by unannounced, avoided direct conversations with John, and when they did speak, his eyes darted nervously. John's instincts, sharpened by years in the military, screamed that something was wrong. He tried to silence the doubts. Emily was his wife, Mark his brother in all but blood, but trust, once cracked, only needed the slightest pressure to shatter. One night, as Emily slipped into the bathroom with her phone, John quietly stood by the door. Through the faint sound of her voice, he caught words that made his blood run cold. She wasn't speaking to her mother, as she had claimed. She whispered affectionately, and John knew instantly it was Mark on the other end. John's training had taught him patience. Acting too quickly could compromise the mission. Now, his mission was uncovering the truth. He started small, checking phone records while Emily was in the shower. Repeated late-night calls to Mark's number stood out like flashing red lights. John's chest tightened, but he needed more than suspicion. He installed a small recording device beneath the couch and left it running when he went for errands. Hours later, he sat in his car, listening to the playback. His heart sank as he heard Emily's voice, soft, playful, intimate, speaking to Mark in ways she hadn't spoken to him in years. The words, "I miss you," and "When can I see you again?" were daggers to his heart. Still, he needed undeniable proof. He began following Emily's movements, waiting for the moment they would slip up. Days later, that moment came. John watched from a distance as Emily got into Mark's truck. They drove to a quiet part of town and disappeared into a motel. John gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had his confirmation. His world had collapsed, but instead of breaking, John grew cold. A plan began to take shape in his mind. John didn't sleep that night. Instead, he scrolled through the photos he had taken. Emily entering the motel, Mark holding the door for her, their shadows framed together in the window. It was undeniable. The people he loved most had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. John sat alone in the dark, the weight of betrayal crushing him. Memories of his marriage flashed through his mind. Their wedding day, Emily's vows, the promise to love him forever. All of it was ashes now. When Emily returned home, she acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed him lightly on the cheek and told him she had been shopping. John forced a smile, his fury boiling beneath the surface. He wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. Instead, he greeted her as if everything was normal, though inside he was calculating. The betrayal cut deep, but John knew that revenge would cut deeper. He would not scream, he would not beg. He would take control of the narrative. And when the time came, Emily and Mark would face the consequences of their deceit in the most unforgettable way. The idea came to him when Emily and Mark suggested throwing a welcome home party. They wanted to invite friends, neighbors, even some of John's old army buddies. To them, it was the perfect opportunity to show off the happy couple reunited after months apart. To John, it was the perfect stage. He agreed enthusiastically, hiding his true intentions behind a mask of excitement. While Emily made plans, John prepared his own. He transferred the recordings from the couch microphone to his laptop, along with the motel photos and the text messages he had recovered. He compiled everything into a video presentation. Cold, undeniable evidence of betrayal. He rehearsed in his mind how the night would unfold. Guests gathered, laughter in the air, Emily smiling at him with false affection. And then when the time was right, John would press play. There would be no screaming match in private, no whispered apologies behind closed doors. The betrayal had been public in its secrecy, and so the justice would be public in its revelation. This wouldn't just be revenge, it would be justice, carefully delivered in front of the people who mattered most. As the party day drew near, John found himself reflecting on his life. Conversations with his fellow soldiers came to mind. They had always told him that the battlefield was easier than civilian life because, at least in war, you knew who the enemy was. Now, the enemy had been in his home, in his marriage, wearing the face of his best friend. John had a brief moment with his children, who noticed the tension but didn't understand it. He hugged them tightly, promising silently that none of this was their fault. Neighbors who had seen Emily and Mark together more than once gave John subtle looks, as if they suspected something but hadn't dared to tell him. Each interaction fueled his resolve. He spoke little, keeping his emotions locked away. In his mind, the plan replayed again and again. Timing was everything. The humiliation had to be complete. The betrayal had been a slow poison. His revenge would be swift, sharp, and unforgettable. The night of the party arrived. The house was filled with chatter, laughter, and music. Emily moved gracefully among the guests, a glass of wine in hand, playing the role of the perfect hostess. Mark was there too, smiling, shaking hands, pretending everything was normal. John played along, greeting his guests warmly, masking the storm inside him. Then came the moment he had been waiting for. He tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady. "It means a lot to me after coming home from deployment to see the people I care about most." Emily smiled at him, touched, until the lights dimmed and the TV behind John flickered on. The video began to play, Emily's voice whispering into the recorder, the motel photos, the text messages. Gasps filled the room. Emily froze, her wine glass slipping from her hand. Mark's face turned pale. John stood tall, watching the truth unfold before the people who needed to see it most. The room erupted in shock. The celebration had turned into a courtroom, and John was the judge. The aftermath was chaos. Emily's tears streamed down her face as she begged John to stop the video, but he stood silent, arms crossed. Mark tried to speak, stammering excuses, but no one listened. The guests murmured, some shaking their heads in disgust, others glaring at Emily and Mark. The truth was undeniable. Friends who had admired their marriage turned away in disappointment. Family members who had trusted Emily felt betrayed themselves. Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing, while Mark stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The carefully crafted image of loyalty and friendship had crumbled in a single evening. John felt a strange calm wash over him. He hadn't shouted, hadn't resorted to violence. He had simply revealed the truth and let it destroy them. The silence that followed was heavier than any battle he had faced in war. But this was his victory, his justice.
After the party, John walked through the empty house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Emily had locked herself in the bedroom, her sobs muffled by the walls. The guests had long gone, their whispers carried into the night. John gathered the evidence, photos, recordings, texts, and placed them in a folder. He no longer needed them. The truth had been spoken. In the days that followed, John filed for divorce, cutting ties with the woman who had betrayed him. Mark vanished from his life entirely. Their lifelong bond shattered beyond repair. It was painful, but John felt lighter, freer. He focused on his children, on his career, on rebuilding his future. He knew trust was fragile and betrayal cut deep, but he also knew that revenge didn't have to be violent. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge was simply reclaiming your dignity and letting the betrayers destroy themselves with their own choices. John closed that chapter of his life with a sense of clarity. The battlefield had taught him survival. Betrayal had taught him strength. And now he was ready to begin again, stronger than before.